Hi there. This is a follow-up lore video for House of the Dragon Season 1, Episode 2, The Rogue Prince. This one I'm going to be going over the Dornish Marches, because there was that scene where Criston Cole explained, I have actual combat experience from fighting in the Dornish Marches, that's where he's from. Now, this is the start of this series. What I said was, every week when there's a new episode, I'm going to do an immediate reaction review, but in coming days throughout the week, I'll do different topical videos, lore videos, on specific things that came up. That instead of some channels do one big hour-long video on everything that came up in the episode, this is narrowed to, I'm going to pick like 2 or 3 specific things per episode every week and go over, okay, this is House Hightower, that's coming in a later week, or this is the Velaryons. Start with here that they mention prominently, well, what are the Dornish Marches? And this is an intro-level thing for if you haven't been exposed to the books and stuff. The Dornish Marches are the borderland between the rest of the Seven Kingdoms and Dorne. But they're not actually in Dorne. The name is misleading. They're the part of the Stormlands bordering Dorne, as you see on the map here. It's sort of like if you're in the United States and you say, I'm going to the Canadian border. Wait, you mean the Canadian side of the Canadian border or the United States side of the Canadian border, like in Vermont or something? That it's the borderland, but it's still within the Stormlands. It's their borderland with Dorne. And one of the big differences in this prequel era is that Dorne is still independent. That the Targaryens didn't manage to conquer them. They resorted to guerrilla warfare at great cost, and they withdrew because it wasn't really worth it. And eventually, 100 years after this, they come into the realm through marriage alliance, but right now Dorne is an independent kingdom. Or, technically it's not a kingdom, it's the Principality of Dorne, but the Dornish Marches are the borderland with Dorne, and they are constantly being fought over. George R. R. Martin borrowed the term from the Welsh Marches back in the Middle Ages. Marches is an archaic word for borderland. It took the Norman kings after the Norman conquest of England, took them almost a century to subdue the independent princes of Wales, and they were never entirely effective. So there's this constant low-level fighting on the Welsh borderland, the Welsh Marches. And that's also why some of the most impressive castles in Britain are along the Welsh border. Dorne is sort of a mashup of Wales with medieval Spain, going by the analogy that Westeros is like a continent-sized fantasy version of Britain. That Martin said it's like the size of South America. It's a continent that's essentially fantasy Britain. Dorne is like a mix of Wales and Cornwall, and they've been filming in Cornwall starting in Season 1 of House of the Dragon. You know, like think of Cornish, Dornish. That Cornwall is also Celtic the way Wales is. But he sort of said, well, it's like their Cornwall or Wales mixed with medieval Spain. It's a desert, that there's a different ethnic group there called the Rhoynar. Well, their ancestors are called the Rhoynar, now they're called the Dornish. But when he says, I'm king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, that's referring to the Dornish. But this isn't just a new thing with the Targaryens since the conquest and forging of the Iron Throne. No, the Dornish Marches existed centuries before the Targaryens came. They were just, for centuries, the borderland between Dorne and the independent kingdom of the Stormlands. And also the Reach, because the Marches are actually located at a tri-point, where all 3 kingdoms meet. So it's usually Stormlanders fighting against the Dornish, but at times the Reach gets involved in this. The Tarleys sometimes got involved in that, from attacking from the west instead of the north. So it's this contested borderland between the 3 of them, and as the power of each of the 3 of them waxes and wanes, they grab more or less of it. Even though there's not much in the Dornish Marches, it's why are you fighting over these blasted heaths and moors up in the mountains? There's nothing there. Well, because they're used as bases for raiding the surrounding areas, that if we ignore the Dornish Marches, the Dornish will use them as a base to raid Old Town, raid the Fields of the Reach, or raid the Rainwood in the Stormlands, so they're constantly fighting over them. And what surprises people is, even though it's technically the western edge of Dorne, it is really cold there. You think, oh, Dorne is this burning desert. Well, it's like the Alps. The Dornish Marches are partially made up by this big mountain chain, one of the bigger ones in Westeros, called the Red Mountains. Red because of the color the sunset makes them. So it's very mountainous, and in between the mountains there's this patchwork of valleys, uplands, windswept moors, and people say it's actually really cold up in the mountains, up in the Dornish Mountains of the Dornish Marches. And there's only really two big passes through these mountains, the Red Mountains. There's the Prince's Pass to the west, and the Bone Way to the east. Criston mentions the Bone Way by name. He says, I was serving in the Bone Way for a year. The Prince's Pass used to be called the Wide Way. It's shorter, wider, it's the easier one for armies to get through, which also means it's the one they've built a lot more castles in, because it was geographically it's easier to get through. It's been fortified a lot more with more castles. The second one to the east, not actually that far from the ocean, but there's a river separating it, is the Bone Way. The Bone Way is longer and narrower, and technically less fortified. There aren't as many castles as in the Prince's Pass. There don't need to be, because the mountains do a good job of fortifying it themselves. That you don't need to build that many. There are little castles and holdfasts at every bend in the road. That the Prince's Pass isn't really a road. It's this steep inclined mountain trail filled with switchbacks that just from horizon line to horizon line, just a couple of 100 feet sometimes, you can see another switchback on this narrow mountain cliff pass, and every bend has a little fort there. So the castles aren't quite as big. They don't need to be. If you're trying to get through, there's Dornish raiders up on the top of the mountains pushing boulders on you with landslides and throwing things at you. It is murder trying to get through that thing. And technically it's called the Stone Way because it's more mountainous. No one calls it by its technical name. Everyone calls it by the nickname the Bone Way, for how many armies have been destroyed trying to get through that thing. That you're just fighting from one valley to the next through this system of passes and goat tracks. And it's just perfect for ambush. Actually, the Dornish Marches as a whole, with these narrow mountain passes and the separated by windswept moors in the middle, and there's just one valley after another, they're loosely almost like Afghanistan. Though this could be said of any mountainous country, but think of when you've seen maps of Afghanistan where they go, geographically, this isn't one country with one ethnicity. It's like every valley, just every horizon line to the next, every valley is like a tiny kingdom unto itself, because there's like only two passes in or out. They can easily fortify and defend these things as choke points, because there's only these narrow valleys to get between them. So it's slow fighting. It's a patchwork of little valleys through tiny mountain passes, and you're fighting from one to the next. In real-time strategy game terms, it's an island map made with mountain terrain. In some real-time strategy maps, it's basically a flat plain and everyone can get to the other bases over them with their armies. This is like an island map where there's just a narrow bridge, but when they do that with mountains where there's impassable plateaus, you see on the map here, I'm just using different RTS game things, where there's narrow passes and each valley is like an island and it's easy to defend and you have to take it one valley at a time. So it's a patchwork of little lordships, and there's bandits and raiders in the mountains. No one really controls it. And they nominally serve the Martells in Dorne just because they don't like everyone else. But it is just constant low-level warfare there. Which leads me into the next point of, haven't they been at peace for 60 years? That they say that in the first episode, we have been at peace since Maegor died, there hasn't been a major war. Then how did Criston Cole get combat experience that they're not at war with Dorne, are they? Well, there's always low-level fighting there. There's a Dornish war when the Martells, who are over on the eastern side in the river valleys past the desert, when they assembled their main armies to attack the Targaryen realm past the mountains, that's a major war. And sometimes a really powerful bandit lord will assemble in the Red Mountains, rally enough of the other Marcher lords and bandit kings together, and fight a proxy war against the Seven Kingdoms. This was the Second Dornish War, was led by a figure called the Vulture King. He was really a bandit lord, but he had 30,000 men under his command. And the Martells weren't directly involved, but they said we were pretty sure that they were secretly giving him gold and funding to fight this proxy war. Even when the Martells aren't serving them, like the Third Dornish War was just a bandit lord, even it's a difference between the Martells actively supporting one of these guys surreptitiously. Even if the Martells aren't actively supporting them, there's little they can do to stop them. Because, like, bandit lords in the Red Mountains don't listen to the Martells no matter what. So that the Dornish Marches really don't know a central government. Their allegiance is nominal, and every valley is functionally, if not on paper, a kingdom unto itself. So it's just, you're constantly fighting from one valley to the next. There's constantly raiders coming out because the fighting never truly ends, because who are you going to do? They'll melt back into the mountains, these raiders. And it's actually a pretty interesting place for, like, if they ever made, and I'm thinking like a World of Warcraft MMORPG style game, a place where you would get a lot of missions is one of the borderland regions, like the Stepstones or the Dornish Marches, because there's constant low-level skirmishing there that never truly ends. So, I mean, I saw even like the book fan site, Westeros.org, and their write-up said that isn't incongruent, that, well, how could there be a Dornish incursion? There's full-scale Dornish wars, and then there's just the day-to-day raiding that never really ends. I mean, look at like Spain and the history of the Reconquista. There were major wars, and then there's just the usual day-to-day raiding and skirmishing that they don't even mark in the history books because it's just going on all the time, even when they're technically at peace. A result of that is that the Marcher Lords are on the north side. They're the Stormlanders bordering the Mountain Lords of Dorne. The Stormlander Marcher Lords that rule this area, that they have to have a very strong martial tradition because they are constantly at least a low-level warfare. And the major ones of the Marcher Lords include House Dondarrion of Blackhaven, who, if you'll remember, Beric Dondarrion from Game of Thrones, that they say, that this is from the book, that Criston Cole's family are House Cole are minor stewards in service to the Dondarrions. Then you have House Caron of Nightsong, who, in the current generation, Lord Boros, his wife, is a Caron, and it's weird that the Caron guy among those Kingsguard candidates is technically also a Marcher Lord, but I guess he just didn't feel like doing any fighting. But the major Marcher Lords are the Dondarrions, the Carons, House Swan of Stonehelm, and also House Selmy of Harvest Hall. That this area produces some of the best warriors. That they've got Beric Dondarrion, also Barristan Selmy of the Kingsguard. You say he's probably one of the greatest living warriors of his generation, from a Marcher family. Also, one of Beric's supporters was Angie the Archer, from like season 3. Remember him? He won the archery contest at Robert's tournament. One of the best living archers, because he's also from the borderland. Arthur Dayne was not a Marcher. Arthur Dayne was a mountain Dornishman. The House Dayne is Dornish. They're from further south. That these guys are constantly fighting over the marches in the valleys. It's like the Norman kings throwing themselves against the Welsh borders with Offa's Dyke and all the little mountains there. Tell me in the comments if, like 10%, a good-sized chunk of my audience is from the United Kingdom. Do you live around Wales or Midlands, England, and you know of, yes, the Welsh Marches, there was all this fighting there, that it was the borderland. So it's an interesting place, because there's this constant low-level fighting there, and just the exciting borderland where the armies are always fighting each other, like the land version of the Stepstones, really. And would we see the Dornish Marches on screen in this show? Probably not. I don't think we ever would, because Dorne is independent. They don't get involved in land warfare. They get involved fighting in the Stepstones, but there isn't really action set in the Dornish Marches in this spin-off, but there would be in other ones. Targaryen Conquest spin-off, if they ever get around to pitching one of those again. They haven't currently now. There was a bad pitch. They rejected it. But, like, when they're done with Dance of the Dragons, they said, eventually we'll get to Targaryen Conquest. We don't want to run it concurrently because it's too similar. A lot of a Targaryen Conquest show would be set in the Dornish Marches, or rather, the mountain passes in the Red Mountains. There's a big story arc there with the First Dornish War, where after they conquered all the other seven kingdoms, the Targaryens under Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters, they tried to take Dorne, and they got hammered in the mountain passes. They managed to temporarily take Sunspear and everything else, then an insurgency sprang up. Biggest thing is Orys Baratheon, the founder of House Baratheon, tried to lead an army through the Bone Way. They got decimated, cut off from their retreat, and he was captured and tortured. So the Dornish Marches would be a major location in, like, season 3-ish of a Targaryen conquest show, after the main conquest. Also, I guess they are actively pitching a Nymeria and the Rhoynar show, but she only gets to Dorne at the end of that story and forcing the lords to submit, who are up in the mountains, because she starts her conquest in the east and then goes west. So you might see a bit of this in the final season of a Nymeria show. The big thing that you're going to see the Dornish Marches in is Targaryen conquest. Maybe a bit of Dunkenegg, because they mention he was serving in Dorne for a year. That's why he missed the plague. But that'll happen later. But that's interesting that he's from the Dornish Marches. He was from the books, and the books never, I already talked about this, that when he was cast, the books never actually say that Criston looks ethnically part Dornish. But even like Westeros Stork said, that makes perfect sense. That it's a borderland where the borders are constantly shifting. It's like someone at the very southern border of France, up near the Pyrenees, actually, oh, you look kind of Spanish. Well, yeah, we're near the border. That they move around, a land border where people, can freely move. That's fine. I think Fabian Frankel, it's they didn't specify this with him. They said he's part Dornish in something, and I think they might explain this in later dialogue. We're only after episode 2 here. That the actor Fabian Frankel, he's a quarter Indian. On his father's grandmother was from the Jewish community of Mumbai, actually. But they say that in the show, oh, he looks kind of Rhoynar, he looks Dornish. That's fine, because the Dornish Marches, it's this constantly shifting borderland. So it's an interesting place, and I'm hoping for the eventual MMORPG. This is one of the places you'd get a lot of missions.